Our first speaker, Andrea Kunard, is an associate curator of photographs at the National Gallery of Canada. She has written extensively and worked on many exhibits. Some of her more recent publications include Stealing the Gaze, 2008, Scott McFarland, A Cultivated View, 2009, Fred Herzog, 2011, Clash, Conflict and Its Consequences, 2012. She has taught in the history of photography, Canadian art, and cultural theory at both Queen's and Carleton. Andrea.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers for this great conference. I've been enjoying myself immensely. So to it, photography is gesture and historical family albums. This paper will explore recent scholarship in photography to address not only the photograph as image, but the photograph as object, as well as activity, by which I mean how photographs are used to make things happen. My main focus will be to apply extended notions of indexicality to a study of 19th century photography in order to broaden an appreciation of the cultural value of the medium. Associated with this discussion is the photograph's material basis that, in addition to its many other functions, creates networks of communication through exchange, collection, and manipulation. These interactions with photographs are most readily evident in photographic albums, as seen in this example taken from the Album Botanique in the National Gallery collection, where an albumen photograph, portrait of a woman, has been mounted on card, has been slipped into an oval window surrounded by lithographed flora and fauna. Because women were the most common assemblers of albums, and possibly the ones who most often interacted with photographs on a daily basis as a means to maintain bonds of friendship and family, their contribution to the medium's rich material history is substantial. Throughout my discussion of the photograph as object, I acknowledge its denotative character as image, as well as its capacity to act as a reminder, memento, a stand-in for memory, and a spur to speech and narrative. However, the photograph is also a declaration. To take a photograph, to have a photograph taken, to place a photograph in an album, or send it in the mail to a distant friend or relative are performances and acts. The photograph, in this sense, is not just a static object. It is a gesture that points to events in the world. These events, in turn, can be examined for their social significance, that is, the manner by which individuals articulate their understanding of themselves and social roles to one another. The extended concept of indexicality to which I refer was introduced by David Green and Joanna Lowry as a way to move discussion beyond the notion of the index alluded to by Roland Barthes in his book Camera Lucida. Although Barthes does not use the term index directly, his story incorporates the notion of the index as trace or impression. Grieving the loss of his mother, he fixates on the idea that the photograph retains a trace of her body through the actions of light on photographic chemicals. This idea that what was, now deceased, can still be as impression on paper has been an important component to discussions of the relationship of photography to death, grieving, and memory. In response to what has now become an orthodox idea of the photographic index, Green and Lowry revisit Charles Sanders Peirce's formulation and propose another. And I acknowledge that there is substantial literature on the index and that sometimes people have been a little bit hard on photo historians in that respect, but nonetheless, we'll carry on. In his well-known discussion, Peirce defined the index as, quote, a real thing or fact, which is a sign of its object by virtue of being connected with it as a matter of fact, and by also forcibly intruding upon the mind, quite regardless of its being interpreted as a sign, unquote. Indexes indicate and create a mental concept. The weather vane indicates wind and direction. We're not really concerned with its actual relationship to the wind. Rather, the wind vane allows us to link in our minds the idea of wind and direction. A sundial indicates the time of day, linking hour and shadow. For Green and Lowry, a photograph is, quote, a performative utterance, a means by which things are not so much represented as designated, unquote. The authors postulate that Peirce, quote, demonstrated that the indexical sign was less to do with its causal origins and more to do with the way in which it pointed to the event of its own inscription, unquote. Simply put, a photograph is indexical because it is a construction and constructs relationships. It is a construction and constructing. It indicates an event in the world and declares it real. By emphasizing the photograph as a performative act or gesture that is declarative, the intentions of the photographer or instigator become paramount. The event designated as real by the photograph is replete with values and beliefs, its credibility established within agreed upon conventions. Moreover, if the photograph as index points to the event of its own inscription, how does that affect our notions of its temporality? As performance, do we necessarily have to relegate its message as occurring in the past, or can we understand it differently? I'm not dispensing with the evidentiary feature of the photograph. Rather, I am emphasizing the performative aspect in order to view photographs, especially historical ones, as consistently present. For example, this photograph depicts a daily event in the latter part of the 19th century of a woman and child having their picture taken in a commercial studio. We can view the event as a record of a photographic session, or we can look at this photograph as an act of display that makes an event significant in the world by declaring it to be real and thus a confirmation of value and belief. In that sense, the woman, through the proxy of the commercial photographer, uses the camera performatively to proclaim her motherhood in the present. Moreover, the photograph continues to maintain the temporal present, the here and now of happening for the future. In its continual encapsulation of present temporality, it prompts future remarks and gestures such as, "This is me with my child." Of course, the photograph can prompt an opposite temporality, such, "This was me with my child." However, such statements ignore the temporal continuity and complexity of the photograph. Even though Barthes used his grieving as a means to exploit the past temporality of the photograph, he and others have also noted the photograph's multi-temporality, its capacity to express different experiences of time concurrently, what was and what is, the here now, the there then, or as one writer puts it, this was now here. I would now like to link this temporal aspect of performance and its relation to indexicality to another aspect of the photograph, its materiality. Photographs are objects, and as such have presence, as seen in these examples of gem or small tintypes with recto and verso views. In the 19th century, as now, people in general, but women especially, sent one another photographs as tokens of friendship and to consolidate familial bonds. This photographic gesture of sending out images further substantiates the multi-temporality of the photograph. The photograph that was taken maintains the presentness of the moment performed for the camera. It is received by someone who acknowledges the past event, but who also, because they hold the photograph as object in the here and now, appreciates the image as emphatically present. Here is John and Mary. Again, it is noted that received photograph can also elicit the opposite response. The recipient, upon viewing and holding the photograph, might dwell on absence and loss. Here is John and Mary. I remember their visit with us and miss them. And again, I propose that these two temporalities dwell in the same photograph as object. Moreover, once we consider the photograph as object, we can acknowledge other temporalities at play. Commentators on the medium, especially those coming from an archival or anthropological background, tend to turn the photograph over and look at its back for inscriptions of historical or social nature. Often what one will see are smudges, penciled-in messages, the embossed stamp of the studio, and other markings that attest to more human interaction and presence of an indexical nature, this time as trace. Although we can choose to focus on such mark-making as evidence of those who are now absent, we can also appreciate their presence and how much more they make this object present to us, testified through our mark making, even though we are far removed from their circumstances. My discussion of the multitemporality of the photograph and its expression of presentness through performance or materiality is not an argument of ontology. Rather, I wish to draw attention to the utility of the photographic medium, its capacity, as I stated earlier, not simply to represent the world, but to make things happen and to declare them to exist. And again, I do not think of this function as simply evidentiary. The photograph's multitemporal aspect is provisional and flexible. On the left is a display in an album where the assembler has taken unmounted photographs, that is, paper photographs, and cut them up to create a playing card motif. On the right, an image of our previously introduced child, now by himself, his photograph mounted on card and slipped into a window surrounded by an elaborate frame of lithographed images of pansies, tulips, bees, and butterflies. This act of assembly, often undertaken by women in the domestic sphere, is a photographic gesture, a means of using the present signification of the figures depicted, the persons familiar to the assembler, to construct a statement or sentiment. Activities abound as a means to declare aspects of the assembler's world. Stories are told, fingers point, pages are held, and photographs cut up, placed on pages, and neatly glued with borders carefully drawn around them. The here and now of these photographic assemblies, doubled in force by the trompe-l'oeil effect of playing cards, presents persons depicted in multi-temporal narratives. Their relative importance in such stories contingent on the whims of the assembler. For example, Jack Hyam, who achieves principal importance at the top of the photographic pyramid in the middle image, is relegated to the bottom of the card pile motif. He appears again at the bottom right, in the page on the right there, where photographs orbit the centrally placed image of Princess Alice, daughter of Queen Victoria, and her two children, possibly Princesses Victoria and Elizabeth. The intentions of the assembler in creating these arrangements are unknown. What can generally be said is that any one individual's importance was relative in the changing narratives of family history. Patricia de Bello has argued that the appearance of peoples in different spots in the album highlights the loss of the photograph's individuality. The images are no longer, quote, literal representations of people or metaphorical comments that have a clear, stable meaning. Instead, they flirt with meaning, unquote. Within the album, the photograph could operate subversively if the assembler wished. I view such collages as yet another photographic gesture that builds upon that of a photographic session, that is, of a person to camera. Moreover, the appearance and disappearance of individuals throughout the albums again underscores the multitemporality of such objects. They combine the here-now of the person depicted with a present material experience of the photograph and album, as well as the there-then that recognizes the past event of the photograph, in addition to the numerous temporalities expressed through narrative as the assembler recounts the individual's significance. As I and others have argued, family albums are replete with visual motifs developed in the domestic sphere. Writers in women's journals such as Gaudy's Ladies' Book and Magazine encouraged industry, attentiveness, and care in the construction of domestic articles to enhance the home, often presenting projects in the work department section. For album assembly, skills developed in sewing and embroidery could be called upon to create imaginative designs. Talent in watercolor and drawing could be used to augment family portraits. The family represented as treasure or a pile of coins, a flower, a seedling from which springs a sprig of wheat. As well, the visual lexicon developed in the domestic sphere was employed to address professional needs, as I've argued with respect to the Sir Daniel Wilson album, where the noted Canadian ethnologist presented his theories of races using the visual motifs of the family album. As much as photographs and albums could entangle viewers and assemblers in the experience of multiple temporalities, they could also create connections across space. The mobility of photographs constructed imagined communities, united not by printed matter, as Benedict Anderson has argued, but by image and touch. Photographs sent through the mail or other means united people at a distance. This activity is another form of photographic gesture, or again, how photographs make things happen. According to Margaret Olin, photographic gestures are not the subject of the photograph, rather they are the activities surrounding it. For example, as she states, as much as photographs can represent community, they also, quote, participate in and create relationships in communities, and the ways communities gather around photographs, unquote. For Olin, photographic activity is extensive and includes taking photographs, looking at them, posing for them, or posting them on websites. Other types of engagement interest her as well, including the work of curators, archivists, and collectors. All these activities, she says, are photographic practices that inform the expectations people have of photographs, how they act in taking them or posing for them, and how photographs acquire their meanings or do their jobs, unquote. Briefly put, as Bourdieu writes, following the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, she describes this as photography's habitus. Briefly put, as Bourdieu writes, habitus allows for, quote, the production of a common sense world endowed with the objectivity secured by consensus on the meaning of practices in the world. In other words, the harmonization of agents' experiences and continuous reinforcement that each of them receives from the expression, individual or collective, improvised or programmed, of similar or identical experiences. The homogeneity of habitus is what causes practices and works to be immediately intelligible and foreseeable, and hence taken for granted, unquote. For Olin, the habitus of photography concerns, quote, the actions that surround photographs and centers on their social function, unquote. By bringing into account all the activities surrounding photography, the photograph's social function and significance is greatly expanded and augments post-structural, post-colonial, and postmodern theories that focus their analysis on the image or subject depicted. This expansion on viewing how photographs act rather than represent has also been addressed by Christopher Pinney, who states that under the influences of theorists such as Susan Sontag and John Tagg, quote, much writing on photography has, in its concern with the ideological effects of picture taking, lost sight of the dialogic space that frequently emerges during the process of picture making. The concern with the political consequences of photography has effectively erased any engagement with its actual practice, unquote. For Olin and others, picture making includes a large number of social practices substantiated through the capacity of photographs to actively create communities. My focus on temporality and its relation to gesture also augments the many discussions related to the photograph's material status. Elizabeth Edwards and Janice Hart have compiled many of these observations in their book, Photographs, Objects, Histories on the Materiality of Images. As material objects, photographs declare their presence or present state to those who employ them to substantiate social rituals and functions, and as Edwards, Martha Langford, and others have argued, demand individuals perform in specific ways. Edwards, in her article, Objects of Effect, Photography Beyond the Image, especially emphasizes the many processes that render photographs as, quote, social objects of agency that cannot be understood outside the social condition of the material existence of their social function, the work that they do, unquote. As well, the very material basis of the photograph, platinum print, albumin Polaroid, signifies certain values and responses, as Joan Schwartz and others have argued. I argue that these considerations serve to greater intensify and diversify the present experience of the photograph and its capacity to encapsulate and communicate multiple experiences of time. If, as this conference posits, we wish to consider different ideas of the self-portrait, we might recall our assembler who, in gazing at the photograph, remembers its origins and acknowledges it as an expression of her own desires for social connections and continuity, be it familial or communal. Sending this object out into the world to family members and friends confirms such social contracts and becomes a meaningful statement within them. Handling the photograph, turning it over to write a note, assessing its placement within a display, cutting, gluing, and augmenting the image by bringing the domestic arts into play, holding the album, turning its pages, pointing and speaking about the images, safeguarding the album in the home. Through such objects, as Jeffrey Batchen notes, quote, we are witness to the creative effect of ordinary people who, exploiting the possibility of a touched and touchable photography, were able to express the intricacies of their social rituals, personal dreams, and projected memories in tangible, visible form, unquote. Through albums and collections, the portrait of the assembly unfolds via multiple visual motifs and temporalities. As a portrait of its assembler's desires, the album retains not simply images, but traces of events initiated by the photographic act, revealing rich relations between photographs and users. Through this extended engagement with photographs, we retain the past as a continued element, confirming not absence, but an active and cherished present with all its possibilities of continued sharing and community. Thank you.